one of the things that a lot of Americans don't realize is that, back when we had several 100 million beavers in North America, there were just ponds and wetlands everywhere, and areas that we think of as being desert today were actually these lush marshes. We need some way of keeping water on the landscape, and beavers are building thousands of little reservoirs for us up in the mountains, right? Keeping that water on the landscape. They're sequestering carbon, they're filtering out pollution, they're creating habitat for all kinds of species. Fish, birds, amphibians, other aquatic mammals. What's it doing to our wildlife? There was a lot of early concern about the impacts of the automobile on nature. There was one biologist even wrote a paper that I found where he called it, he referred to the car as the devil wagon, this kind of evil contraption that was killing all of these critters. You read about the early vivisectionists, who would dissect dogs alive in the 19th century because they just didn't think that a non-human being was capable of experiencing any kind of pain or negative emotion. I mean, the single most dangerous wild animal in North America is the white-tailed deer.
Welcome to Working with Wildlife, where I, your host, Jaden Lunt, speak to experts and enthusiasts in different fields of nature to find out how and why they do what they do. Have you ever been driving in a car and almost hit a piece of wildlife? Have you been driving down a road and you've seen a dead animal or injured animal on the side of the road? Did you know that some people believe that wildlife come to the side of the road just to die? Though we know that is not true, in this conversation we're going to be hearing about road ecology from the author of Crossings, how road ecology is shaping the future of our planet. It's a very fascinating and in-depth read, easy for any person to understand, but yet scientific and to the point. During the conversation, the video gets a little bit choppy, so if you're watching this episode and you want to just listen to the audio version, head down to the description of the video and you'll find a link to Spotify. It'll take you right there. Otherwise, if you're already listening to the episode, stay where you are and get ready to listen to conservation journalist Ben Goldfarb.
Ben, thank you very much for coming on to this podcast and taking time out of your day to have a conversation about all things wildlife and road ecology. I don't think that people will be looking at roads the same way they did before they heard this conversation. How the day's going so well for you? It's nice and sunny, you said?
Yeah, it's a beautiful day here in Colorado, USA, which is where I live. So we're enjoying the winter for sure.
Now, Ben, you're an author of a couple books, one being on beavers is an expertise of yours, as well as road ecology. And so, like I said, I want to get into the road ecology side of things. What is road ecology? I learnt that yearly in America, or at least a part of America, it costs $8 billion worth of damage due to wildlife interactions with cars, which is crazy. So that's a lot of money. But why is that the case, and is there something that we can do about it? But first, could you give us a bit of a run through of what your professional experiences are and titles as such?
Sure. So I'm an environmental journalist, so I write articles and books about nature and wildlife and conservation. I've been doing that for a little over 10 years, and it's a really fun, interesting, exciting life. I get to travel all over the country and occasionally the world.
Awesome.
Meeting interesting people who have devoted their lives to conservation, and it's really just a great gift and a privilege to be able to tell their stories and to be able to write about the ecological issues and the species that I care about. So it's a pretty sweet gig for sure.
Yeah, amazing to be able to travel for work. That's like a dream job, for so many people to be able to travel. And we'll get into a little bit on how you've been able to do that. But is there anything that you're working on right now, field work wise? You had your road ecology. You did that book in 2023, and you created a book on beavers, and their impact on the environment back in 2018. Is there anything you're working on at the moment, or looking into the future, what you might be working on?
Yeah, I'm writing a book right now about fish, and fish especially fish movement and migration is this kind of keystone ecological and cultural process. Here in the US,
Mm.
for example, we have salmon, right? And salmon, they're born in fresh water, they go out to the ocean, they get really big, then they come back into river systems, the same places they were born. They spawn, and then they die, and they're eaten by
Mm.
bears and wolves
Yeah.
and eagles, and so that they're nourishing entire ecosystems, and the nitrogen and phosphorus in their bodies gets taken up by trees, and so they're essential to forest growth in the Pacific Northwest. So that's the kind of thing that
So
this book is about.
good.
Fish migration is this kind of critical process that's secretly shaping our world's ecosystems.
So that was a pretty neat description of your book. You seem pretty passionate about these smaller about these ecosystems and the small things that are impacting them in a big way. People might see a group of fish swimming up the estuary or the creek system as they're walking over a bridge, but they don't think or even consider the impact that fish's life or that group of fish is going to have on the environment. Same with beavers, the impact on that they have on our worlds. Maybe could you give us a little bit of a quick explanation of why you thought it was first there was a market for your beaver book on beavers, and what sort of impact, quick overview of, I guess, of the book is what I'm trying to ask, and
Yeah,
what that
sure.
looks like.
Right. So beavers. I don't know how much your Australian audience knows about beavers, Jaden. But
No. Yeah, yeah.
most. I bet that most listeners know that beavers build dams, right? And those
Yep.
those dams create ponds and wetlands. It's beavers. If you like taught a platypus to build a dam, that could be a useful thing to do in Australia. But those the
Would be.
ponds and the ponds and wetlands that form behind beaver dams, they provide all kinds of ecological services and benefits, right? I mean, I live here in the American West, right? And here it's very dry. It's becoming hotter and drier because of climate change. So we need some way of keeping water on the landscape. And hey, beavers are building thousands of little reservoirs for us up in the mountains, right? Keeping that water
Mm.
on the landscape. They're sequestering carbon, they're filtering out pollution, they're creating habitat for all kinds of species. Fish, birds, amphibians, other aquatic mammals. Here in the
Yeah.
West, just like in Australia, we've got lots of wildfires, right, which are getting worse with climate change and as well. And so guess what? Water doesn't burn, right? So when beavers spread water out over the landscape, they're creating these kind of fire refuges and fire breaks. So beavers are just providing all of these really useful environmental services. This is an animal that historically we didn't, we just haven't treated well in North America, right?
Okay.
First, starting in the 1600s, fur trappers and traders began basically wiping them out for their pelts. And now that their populations are recovering, a lot of people consider them nuisances because their
Really?
ponds flood roads and they cut down people's fruit trees and they build dams and irrigation ditches and so on. And so lots of beavers, fewer beavers are killed now for their pelts, but lots of them are still killed for getting into these conflicts with human infrastructure. And
Yeah.
so
Okay.
the point of my beaver book, Eager, was just to say, hey, these are incredibly useful animals. There's this growing movement to protect and restore them, and let's give these critters the respect they deserve and learn to live alongside them rather than wiping them out. So that's the
Against them.
call to action there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What was your first introduction to beavers? What got you onto this trail of beaver ecology?
Man, it's funny. I've always really liked them. I grew up hiking and camping and fishing. Spending lots of time outside, and so I was always around them. I have this early childhood memory of canoeing with my parents on this lake in upstate New York, and we were out there at night, and suddenly we heard this just explosive, almost like a gunshot or like somebody had thrown a giant rock into the lake, and that was whacking its tail with water, and they do that, warn other beavers about the presence of predators. So I have that, that powerful early memory. So I always liked
Wow.
beavers. And then a little more than 10 years ago, I was, working as a journalist. I was looking for stuff to write about, and somebody sent me
Yes.
this advertisement for a beaver workshop. And I didn't know what that meant, but I thought, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. Could be a story there. So I went to this beaver, one scientist after another to getting up to say their piece about how important beavers were for salmon habitat and drought mitigation and wildfire prevention and water quality, all of these different benefits they were providing. So it was that day that I realized that what, beavers aren't just this cute, fun, interesting rodent that I kind of grew up with. They're actually one of the most architects of our ecosystems, and an animal that we really need to restore.
And for your book, did you end up speaking to many of those scientists that you first met on that beaver education talk?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of those folks at that workshop are in the book. There's one guy, kind of one of my beaver mentors, this guy named Kent Woodruff, and he lives in Washington State. And he was at that workshop. I came up to him and I said, "Hey, can I come hang out with you this summer?" And he said, "Yeah." And basically, he was
Awesome.
at the time he was the director of this beaver project that basically live trapped beavers in places where they were causing conflict, where they were eating people's apple trees or flooding roads. So he would live trap those beavers, and then he would transport them up into the mountains, far from human property, and release them
Mm.
where they could build their dams and do their thing. So we spent a week, traveling around that area, capturing beavers, relocating them, checking out some of the sites where he had moved them previously, and they were doing their thing.
Yep.
So yeah. So Kent, he was just a great guy. He's really good at talking about the landscape. I think that's one of the things that a lot of Americans
Yeah.
don't realize is that back when we had several hundred million beavers in North America, there were just ponds and
Wow.
wetlands everywhere, and
Mm.
areas that we think of as being desert today were actually these lush marshes, full of
Amazing.
waterfowl, because beavers kind of ponded everything up. And so this guy Kent Woodruff, he was just so good at evoking that pre-colonization beaver-rich landscape, what it looked like and
It's
felt
very
like, and
passionate.
just very passionate. Yeah, exactly. And he transferred a lot of that passion into me, I think.
I'm curious with beavers. In Australia, crocodiles, they can't be released back into. Well, they can't really be released when they say people when the government here says that they've been um, relocated or removed. There's a bit of a clause I've recently found out that when they say removed, that could also mean euthanasia. And so crocodiles, there was a study done back when Steve Irwin was around. That he took them a fair whiles away, but they would still find their way back to the original location. I guess my question is, Ben, is beavers anything like that? Is that a concern that Americans have as well?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I mean, there are states that don't permit beaver relocation at all. There, like a lot of the eastern states. You really can't relocate a beaver. If a beaver's causing a problem, killing that animal, unfortunately, is sort of the default option. Whereas other western states, especially Colorado, where I live, Washington State, California now, you can pick these animals up and move them, and they don't really seem to have that homing instinct. They don't go back
Yeah.
to where you put them.
Where their roots
Oftentimes,
were
I mean,
put
if
down.
you're
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Especially if you release them into good habitat. If the habitat is there, they'll probably stick around. What a lot of
Content
beaver.
creatures.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ideally, not always, but what a lot of
Maybe
beaver.
everyone's okay.
What a lot of beaver relocation projects will do now actually is they'll build a little starter dam for them. Not a full dam. They'll just kind of put
Okay.
some put some wood into the stream and create a little bit of backed up water, so that the beaver's like, okay, there's already a little bit of a dam and a pond here. This is probably a good place to live, and they'll hang out. I mean, the biggest issue that we have with beaver relocation is, a lot of them get eaten, right, by bears and mountain lions and wolves. I mean, if you move a beaver into a place where it doesn't have its dam and its pond and its lodge, its house yet, they're vulnerable right off the bat. So, definitely a lot of those relocated beavers get eaten.
Wow, I feel like it could have been a podcast title: "Building dams with beavers." That sounds like an interesting job description to have. To be like, yeah, when I grow up, I'm gonna help beavers build dams. That's quite interesting. I think even we could then flow into road ecology with that. You said that beavers, they build dams and they flood roads. Roads, as I'm reading in your book, and I've been curious about it for a while, but this is explained it the best to me. Roads, they are everywhere. They cover, I think you stated in America, you could go to the moon and almost make it all the way back with all the roads that traverse America, which is pretty something. Did I state that correctly?
Yeah, that's actually, you could go to the moon and back only on the old logging roads that we have in the U.S. That's to say nothing of like the big paved highways. We've got
Wow.
4 million miles of road in the U.S. So you could go to the moon and back, I don't know, a dozen times or something like that, if you include all of the roads. Yeah.
All the roads. So, could a road going through? We live on roads pretty much. There's no person apart from some uncontacted tribes in the Amazon who has seen proper roads. Even they've got their own example of roads. But what do modern roads do to the environment that generally people don't consider or are aware of? I know that there was a comment you made in your book was that. The impact of wildlife deaths on roads, roadkill, increase not just due to the speed of cars, but also the improvement of roads also impacted that. So could you speak a little bit on that for us?
Well, yeah, I think you're making a really good point, which is that there are some impacts of roads that are obvious, right? We've all seen, here in the U.S., we've seen the dead deer or raccoon or a possum or squirrel by the side of the highway, right? You guys in Australia, you see kangaroos and wallabies and wombats and all of those wonderful marsupials, and so that's kind of the obvious relationship, right? The one that we're all accustomed to, and in the book I talk a lot about roadkill, but I also talk about some of those subtler interactions that you were mentioning. I think a lot about road noise, for example. The constant noise of engines and tires. I mean, if you're an animal like a songbird, for example, you've got to sing to attract a mate. Well, if your mate can't hear you because there's so much engine and tire noise along that road corridor, you can't live in that place, right? If you're an owl, an animal with incredibly sensitive hearing, you have to listen, for the sound of your prey walking around in the leaf litter. You're listening for that rodent, and if you can't hear that rodent because there's so much traffic noise, again, you can't live in that spot. So, I find that a really powerful idea that, that traffic noise is actually this form of habitat loss that's driving animals away from really large areas, right? I mean, a road itself might only be, 50 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet this road noise is just bleeding out into the environment, sometimes for several miles, and just affecting every animal that's encountering that acoustic pollution.
Which is another kind of pollution that isn't. I didn't consider a lot until you'd mentioned in your book. I think of noise pollution in the industrial industry, in cities, and it impacts people. I think even just recently I was up to a section in your book talking about noise pollution, how it affects people's sleep, and then their quality of sleep, and that also then affects the safety of people on roads, and also generally in the community, because people are their sleep is affected. Correct me if I'm wrong. it was back only not even 100 years ago. Road ecology wasn't really a thing. There was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question statement you made in the book, which is why did the road cross the land? And that was really only a question that was being asked. I think back in 1970 was when road ecology really kicked off. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two phases of road ecology, right? There's, there is an early. Yeah, and even though the term didn't exist yet, but if you go back to the 1920s, as the car starts to take over the American countryside, there are early wildlife biologists in 1925, who are writing papers counting up dead ground squirrels and woodpeckers and all of these animals that they're finding, along these rural roads, and they're saying, hey, wait a second, this newfangled invention, the car, what's it doing to our wildlife? There was a lot of early concern about the impacts of the automobile on nature. There was one biologist even wrote a paper that I found where he called it, he referred to the car as the devil wagon, this kind of evil contraption that was killing all of these critters. But you're right that then over time, the car just becomes normalized in American society, and people stop really thinking about it. It's just sort of like, okay, the car is everywhere. It's kind of failed to worry about this too much. But then, in the 1960s and 70s, scientists do start thinking about animal vehicle collisions again. And the reason for that is that, by the 1960s, all of these white-tailed deer are starting to show up in American suburbs, right?
That's the connection was. Yes, wild-tailed deer. Yes, continue. Wild-tailed deer. That was a big change, yes.
Exactly, right. So, so deer, this animal that were historically very abundant, another animal that we basically wiped out in the 19th century. But, in the 20th century, these animals are starting to recover. Suddenly, there are all of these big mammals, wandering across our highways, right? Back when people were only hitting, turtles and snakes and squirrels, it wasn't a risk to driver safety, right? It was a problem for the animals themselves, of course. But, nobody's ever died when they hit a squirrel, right? Whereas, if you hit a 150-pound deer going 70 miles an hour, that can really mess you up, right? And hundreds of drivers are killed in these deer collisions. Just as drivers die in kangaroo collisions too. Sometimes, I know. And so that's really when road ecology starts to become this kind of powerful, influential science. This mainstream idea exactly is when when those deer start showing up. And suddenly everybody's like, wait a second, it's not just the animals who are at risk here, it's us drivers as well. And so we have to figure out a way to prevent these animal crashes.
Yeah, and I think it was even just a section yesterday. There was a gentleman who was very poignant in the road ecology section field. I think it was after the 1970s, maybe 1990s, back in when Harrison Ford, the creator of Ford Motors, was around, and they were starting to become buddies. And one of the road ecology wildlife group and the automotive industry kind of did have some impact on each other because originally we didn't have steering columns that would collapse on impact. And so a lot of people would end up just getting impaled by the steering column. But that kind of changed because there was some communication between the two industries. But 8 billion, I'm thinking 8 billion is a lot of money for a country to lose due to accidents involving animals. I think you said in 2021 there's a recalculation that moose cost about $41,000 per impact averaging. What kind of small filtered down impacts do the wildlife collisions with vehicles have on a community and on a country?
Yeah, the impacts are really enormous, right? I mean, the average deer collision costs more than $9,000 And, we're talking about all of the different, there's hospital bills and vehicle repairs and insurance costs and, the tow truck you have to call to haul the totaled vehicle away. And, of course, the animal itself has, intrinsic value, which we're, really not very good at calculating yet. But, I think there are basically, there are studies, showing that the sort of the American public values every grizzly bear in Yellowstone National Park at several $1,000,000, right? So when one of those bears is hit by a car, as happens too often, that's this enormous loss to society, in a way that that goes really beyond just the damage to the car, right?
Yeah.
And as you say, the average moose collision is more than $40,000, and so it's just this is kind of this immense cost, and it's also a huge public safety risk, right? There's a big danger there. The single most dangerous wild animal in North America is the white-tailed deer, right? And that's not the deer's fault. It's kind of the fault of automotive society. But I think that goes to show just how frequent these incidents are, and how incredibly dangerous they are, and how important it is to start preventing some of these crashes, as we're trying to do now.
Yeah, talking about preventing, what are we doing as I guess a human, a group of people? What are we doing as governments and as individuals to kind of mitigate this human and wildlife interaction on roads?
Yeah, the best tool that we have at our disposal, right, are wildlife crossings, which is any kind of bridge or tunnel or culvert or underpass that allows animals to safely move from one side of the road to the other. And here in the U.S., we've got deer and elk and antelope and bear and mountain crossing. You guys in Australia, you've got there's a koala bridge out there. There are a lot of there's a kind of a famous, and I wish that my Australian geography was better, then I would know exactly where all of these things are. But
there's
there's
a lot of bridges
famous
on the east coast, around Gold Coast and New South Wales, I think. But yes, love, there's a famous bridge you're saying.
I think that's right. I know that there are there's a famous tunnel for pygmy possums out there, the Pygmy Possum Love Tunnel, that was built in the 1980s. I think that was one of the first wildlife crossings built in Australia.
Okay.
In the book, I talk a little bit the Love Tunnel. Oh yeah, look that one up. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know that it was effective. And then in the book, I talk a little bit about these great canopy crossings that were built for squirrel gliders. This is a project that Kylie Soanes, who's a great ecologist and urban ecologist in Australia, worked on, and basically these poor little squirrel gliders, they've got this is in Victoria somewhere. Their forest fragments are kind of chopped up by highways, and they're genetically isolated. And so what this project did was basically build these rope bridges and ladders, these canopy crossings connecting these forest fragments. And Kylie and those other researchers found that those squirrel gliders did use those crossings, and that was there was genetic exchange, among those forest fragments because of those crossings. Those squirrel gliders were running back and forth and mating on either side, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot of cool stuff happening in Australia, a country that I think is pretty good about valuing the really special wild.
Blush for a moment there, but in Australia, there's a pretty good value you were mentioning.
Yeah. I think that that's not always the case. One of the places I went in this book was Tasmania, right? Tasmania has the highest roadkill rates on Earth that have ever been recorded, and unfortunately, not much has been done about that. That's really a place with a deficit of wildlife crossings and fences. So, I don't want to say that the problem is solved by any stretch, but to me as as an American, I do look at Australia and think, it does seem like on mainland Australia, there is a strong and growing commitment to address some of these issues.
Wow. And thinking about these wildlife mitigation, wildlife crossings, in your book, you're mentioning there's not just one style of crossing that solves all problems. Different kinds of antelope or deer or bears prefer to cross over or under. Then you've also got the consideration of how many cars per minute and cars per day, which impacts the amount of noise pollution. I think deers need to have a whitetail potentially to feel confident to cross, or maybe some other species of deer need like a minute or a minute 30 between cars before they would confidently cross or something like that. So, but even if those numbers are incorrect in my memory, the point is that there is more to consider than just, okay, look, there's a gap, take it. Another interesting thing in your book that you mentioned, Ben, was that more people in less developed countries, down to 5 seconds, they're happy to cross between cars. But as you move on into more populated and well-developed countries, the time period between cars before a person feels confident to cross increases as well. So you've really studied well into this book. Could you give us one great example of road ecology and the wildlife crossings as a success, and also one of maybe the more challenging and tough stories that you have of wildlife being killed on roads? The two polar opposites. Do you have any in mind?
Some of the animals I always think about, you mentioned those deer, right? And here in the American West, we have a lot of our deer and our antelope and our elk. A lot of our wildlife is migratory, right? These are animals that are walking in big herds over large distances, and that's just because it's here in the West. It's cold in the winter, it's snowy in the summer, it gets really hot. So if you're an animal, you have to kind of wander around the landscape looking for these seasonal resources that are popping up.
Yeah.
You have to find food in a different place in summer versus winter, and so these animals have to walk really long distances. And of course, if you're walking a long distance in the United States of America, you're going to end up crossing a road at some point, right? Or at least trying to cross a road. And so, I think to your point about the great challenges that a lot of these animals face, and to your point as well about, how hard it is for animals to cross densely trafficked roads. One of the places I went in this book was southwestern Wyoming, a big kind of desert, arid, high desert state. And there, there's this herd of deer in a place called the Red Desert that are walking about 300 miles round trip. They're migrating. And the challenge they face is that the kind of the southern end of their winter range, where they like to spend the winters, is basically cut off by a big interstate highway. And the problem there is that there's so much traffic on that highway that those deer never even try to cross the road, right? You were saying earlier how, deer need a gap in traffic that they can run through. Well, if there's never any gap in traffic, right, you just can't cross the road.
Yeah.
And so as a result, some years, a lot of those animals will actually starve to death because they can't cross the highway to find the really good winter habitat. So that's one of the big challenges I think about, is that barrier effect, right, that highways create, and the way they cut off those animal movements and migrations, especially for those migratory species, right? And then when it comes to really good examples of successful wildlife crossings, I mean, in the same general area in Wyoming, there's this famous spot called Trapper's Point near a town called Pinedale. And there's kind of this narrow bottleneck in the landscape that just funnels, thousands of these migrating deer and antelope, through this narrow spot. And of course, that spot has a highway running through it. And so, these animals are just getting slaughtered on this highway. And so, the state of Wyoming, going back more than 10 years now, built a couple of overpasses, bridges, and then a number of underpasses as well. And, the underpasses get used mostly by the deer, and then the overpasses get used primarily by those antelope, the pronghorn. And the reason for that is that antelope are, they're the fastest land mammal in North America. They're
Fastest, okay.
incredibly fast animals. They're really fast. They've got amazing eyesight. So they're an animal that evolved to detect, to see their predators from long distances away, and then to outrun them in the open country, right? So that's not an animal that wants to be in a little narrow tunnel. They want to be up on the deck of a bridge where they can see the predators coming and run away, right? So to your point earlier, you have to understand the biology of different animals and how they experience these wildlife crossings. But those wildlife crossings at that spot they've been incredibly successful. They've been used hundreds of thousands of times at this point. They've saved the public a huge amount of money in crash prevention. So they've been incredibly successful. So there you go. There's the problem, is that the disruption of these ungulate migrations in the American West, and you've got the solution, these overpasses and underpasses that let these migrations safely continue.
And I could definitely take a stab at what ungulate means, and I think I would explain it, but with more words. Could you explain it with less words? What an ungulate is?
Just a hooved mammal.
Sweet.
I know kangaroos and wombats don't exactly have hooves. So just those ungulates, those deer, elk, antelope, moose, those are kind of the big ones that we have walking around our landscapes. Bighorn sheep, mountain goats. That's what you got to watch out for.
Yeah, man, the bighorn sheep, those are some impressive horns on those fellas. I've seen them. I've seen him. Haven't seen them in person, but I can tell you that watching David Attenborough has opened my eyes. That's for sure. Now,
they're cool.
They are. Now, Ben, I'd like to get into a little bit of like how you've been able to get to this present day 2025. You're working on your third book. You've already written two. You've had many amazing experiences. You've worked with mountain lions, ungulates, beavers, snakes, reptiles, amphibians. You've worked really with a lot. They're very diverse, and you get to travel the world doing what you love, and impacting lives along the way in a positive way. Why did you see not why. What was the main reason that you thought, hey, I can write a book, and I'm going to write a book to make a change? You said you had an experience as a journalist. Were you thinking you were going to be writing books before you were a journalist? So did this come about during your journalism, and like that's kind of what started the idea, or have you always wanted to be an author?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny. I feel like Australia is really important to my answer in a lot of ways. When I was in college, I was really studying creative writing and literature. I loved wildlife and nature, but certainly didn't have any kind of scientific background. And then when I was in my third year of university, I had a chance to do this tropical ecology study abroad program in Australia, in the Atherton tablelands.
Such an amazing place.
Inland of Cairns. Amazing place. Yeah. Really wonderful. So I did this, this tropical ecology field course. And I didn't have any kind of scientific background, but it just seemed like a kind of a fun, interesting thing to do. Always wanted to go to Australia. And while I was there, we were, a lot of the research that field station was doing was about bats, not the big fruit bats that you guys have, not the flying foxes, but the smaller micro bats. Yeah, exactly. The insect eating bats. And one of my first nights there, we went out trapping bats in these in harp traps, basically. You put this kind of stringed trap up in a little flyaway in the rainforest, and the bats would hit the string and fall into a bag, and then you could weigh and measure them and so on, and figure out what species were living there in these different forest fragments. And so we went out, we that first night, we went out there, set up the trap, caught a bat right away, and put it in a bag. And I just remember like holding this little warm vibrating, delicate animal, against me in the bag, and it was just the I don't know, man. It was just the most. It was a really emotional moment for me.
Well,
It was really powerful. This animal was so vulnerable. It was living in this very small fragment of forest in this increasingly developed landscape, and I kind of feel like I'm not sure that I knew I was going to be writing books about wildlife, but I think it was kind of in that moment that I knew on some level that I was going to end up, devoting my life to conservation in some capacity.
wow. I've worked a little bit with microbats. Do you know what species there was
Yeah.
that you call it that night?
Yeah, that was man. Now I'm forgetting the common name, but the Latin name was Miniopterus
Wow, you
australis.
know what? That's
Um,
that's amazing that you don't remember the common name, but boy oh boy, you can remember the scientific name. Those ones I struggle with the scientific names. That's amazing.
well, I'm looking. I'm 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 looking it up right now because I got of course, how could I forget? It's the little bent wing.
A little bent wing. Wow, I haven't seen those ones. There was
Is that else?
not yet, not yet. Anyway, I need to
The
go
little
and
bent wing.
I need to go
Yeah.
catch bats up in the Northern Territory in the Atherton
Okay.
Tablelands. I actually spoke to a gentleman that works in the Atherton Tablelands and lives in the Atherton Tablelands recently. Tree
It
kangaroo.
sounds like it. Yeah.
Did you see any tree kangaroos while you're up there?
Yeah, we definitely saw a couple. Yeah, didn't work with them in any capacity, but saw him for sure, and was just loved him. Also, my favorite. I mean, I know these guys are like a dime for you, but I just love patamelons, man. I think patamelons are so cute. They're so much fun. I love a little patamelon.
Patty melons is where I left. I got lost there, but you love the patty melons, the little fellas there.
Oh, sorry. Did I maybe my broke up? And yeah, I love Pat. I know. Be like Australian visiting the United States and saying, I really like gray squirrels. I know they're kind of all over the place, but they're so cute. They're just such fun, neat little critters. So I remember falling in love with patamelons.
Wow. Thinking about little fellas and wildlife, talking about road ecology, a strong point that you have a lot of experience in. If animals could leave a Yelp review on the quality of roads, what do you think they would say?
I think they would give our roads 1 star for sure. I mean, look, obviously roads they're so dangerous in so many ways. And I mean, like one of the things I always think about from an animal's perspective is like how confusing a road must be, right? I mean, here's this, weird, you're walking through the forest and then suddenly there's this weird eerie linear clear cut, out of the
Mm,
middle of nowhere, and I'm sure it probably smells really bizarre. All of that asphalt, it probably, it certainly smells like death, right?
mm,
I'm sure that animals on some level, instinctively know that this is a dangerous place because of that, that scent of all of the previous critters who have died. And that's
mm.
actually, that's one of the things that makes roads dangerous, actually, for scavengers like Tasmanian devils. Is you get you get a patamelon or a wallaby killed, and that draws the scavengers to the road, and then they get killed, right? And we see that
Yes.
here in the U.S. with coyotes and eagles and our scavenging animals. So yeah, and then of course there's traffic, right? I mean, like what do animals make of these gigantic, bright, loud, incredibly fast
Yeah.
things that are just roaring along the highway? I mean, it must be, again, it's so disorienting and confusing, and yeah, it just must be a really bizarre sensory experience for wildlife on every level.
Talking about those descriptive words of an animal, how do you balance, or do you think how hard do you think it is to balance between with anthropomorphizing an animal's experience? Because we see through our own eyes, we observe what we think is their behavior, and as a scientist, I'm sure you are very well aware, and you are very conscious of that in your research, and in fact how you write shows that. I love how you describe the expand upon and describe some of the stuff, the things in your book. I loved it. But do you think that's more of a concern with newer and upcoming scientists and ecologists, or do you think that's a problem that all experience levels face?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I when I think about anthropomorphization, I mean, look, I think that as we learn more about how animals think and feel and experience the world, we just learn more and more about how sentient and empathetic and intelligent so many of these critters are, and how social they are.
Mm.
You almost never see new research saying that animals are dumber and less thoughtful than we thought they were, right?
Mm.
It seems like we're just learning so much about how how incredibly sophisticated animals are, and so in that sense, like the idea that animals feel anxiety or fear when they approach a road, or that they grieve their kin when other animals are killed by cars. That doesn't seem far-fetched at all to me. And there's actually a great term, kind of the inverse of anthropomorphization, by the now deceased primatologist Franz de Waal, and he coined the word anthropodenial. The idea that there are all of these emotions and thoughts that we attribute to ourselves as humans, and yet we deny them in other animals. We say it's not possible that that those other creatures are as intelligent and sentient and thoughtful and conscious as we are. And so I think in some ways maybe that anthropodenial is a bigger risk than anthropomorphization. We should ascribe the same virtues to other animals as we ascribe to ourselves.
What do you think is like the base point of the anthropomorphization? How do you say it again? The
anthropodenial.
Anthropodenial and anthropomorphism. They're two differencing thoughts. What foundation do you think is the reasoning behind both of those, and why one group thinks it's not possible that the other group could have more reason than the other?
It's a really good question. It's a good question for an animal behaviorist, or maybe a philosopher. And I mean you could go back to the writings of René Descartes, right, talking about how animals are automatons. And basically saying that they're incapable of feeling pain. Or I mean, you read about like the early vivisectionists, who would dissect dogs alive in the 19th century, because they just didn't think that a non-human being was capable of experiencing any kind of pain or negative emotion. I mean, I think that part of it is, maybe, I mean, a lot of it is just sort of putting ourselves on a pedestal, right, as the the best and most sentient and most intellectually sophisticated animal. And of course, I mean, humans are incredible, right? We have this amazing capacity for abstract thought and language and so on. And yet, the more we learn about how other animals think and feel and experience the world, the more we recognize that, language is not unique to us, right? Other animals have complex language with syntax, and other animals, grieve their kin when they die, and engage in play behavior that would be recognizable to any parent of a small human child, right? And so, the more we understand these other animals' worlds, the more we recognize that maybe we're not quite as exceptional as we believed we were.
It's curious to me that vivisectionalists, is that the
Yeah.
term, something like that? Um, it's curious to me that an individual could, because that's so foreign, that idea and concept, I think, to the larger of the population today, that of course, like a dog would respond to that kind of pain, but in the moment, and those people that were doing that, they were observing something, but they translated it as something else. Whereas us now in the present 2025 would think that that's ludicrous. It's an interesting uh, thing to consider, that seeing how dogs react through my own eyes and through your own eyes, we would say obviously there is some feeling of pain in that, but evidently not for them.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
and I mean, and to bring it back to roads and road ecology, I mean, I think that look, that knowledge that that animals are smarter and more sentient and more more capable of suffering than we historically understood them to be. I mean, that's a an enormously important reason to mitigate the impacts of our roads, right? And I think it's one that sometimes gets lost in conversations with scientists. I think if you were to go to a road ecologist and say, why should we build wildlife crossings and let animals cross roads safely? They would say, well, I mean, we have to conserve wildlife populations, right? We don't want species to decline. They might say, we want to prevent, these dangerous, expensive crashes that are bad for drivers and public health and safety. And those
Right.
are all good reasons. But I think that another good reason that a lot of scientists maybe aren't as comfortable as talking about is that prevention of animal suffering, right? The fact that there's, probably nothing that we do, maybe aside from industrial agriculture, that that induces more pain and suffering and misery in animals than drive, right? I mean, unfortunately, when we hit animals, especially big animals, often they don't die right away. A lot of those animals are kind of staggering off, into the forest and dying over the course of many days in agony. So anyway, it's not, it's not a fun conversation to have, right? But I do think it's, an important thing to think about, because
So
it's
something
just
less
another,
consider.
there's, right. I mean, like, there are all of these good conservation and economic reasons, for dealing with the impacts of our roads. But then there's also this huge moral and ethical reason, which is, the mitigation of suffering.
Yeah, and I think that would be a really interesting conversation to even dive down deeper on, maybe at a later date, even with yourself. I think that would be valuable to kind of tear apart, for lack of a better term, the idea that animal suffering and what that looks like for us as a
Yeah, and you
society
should.
moving forwards.
Well, yeah. Well, instead of talking to me, you should talk to my friend Brandon Keim. He's got a great new book out called "Meet the Neighbors," which is about sort of the intellectual and emotional experience of a lot of kind of familiar backyard animals here in the U.S.
Mm.
And and the importance of considering sort of those animal welfare standpoints in conservation, in addition to the health of populations. Anyway, you should talk to Brandon. He'd be a great guest on the podcast.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll reach out to him. Talking about this emotional side of and consideration of animals, it takes a bit of heart. You have to have heart to be able to have this, at least as a thought, to think about animals. Could maybe use that to talk about a little bit of what your younger years were like, and what kind of formulated this now present day focus on the wildlife over the past decade or so for yourself. You said before that you grew up going out into the bush, going on hikes, camping, and you enjoyed that kind of stuff. Was the family that you grew up in like a wildlife adventure family, or were you just sneaking out of the house and sleeping in trees?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, they were, my parents were they're definitely nature lovers. They, care deeply about wildlife, although they're not ecologists themselves, but they're, certainly wonderful, concerned, passionate people who care a great deal about nature, and were wonderful about taking me, hiking and camping. I mean, I actually feel like a lot of my interest in wildlife emerged from fishing, which is not something that my parents did or were interested in, but something that I always just gravitated to for reasons that I can't totally explain. So I grew up doing a lot of fishing, always loving fish and being fascinated by them. I mean, that was, in some ways why I got into the beaver world, is that beavers create great fish habitat, right? And, as a person who'd spent a lot of time in and around streams, that was one of the things that had exposed me to beavers and got me interested in beavers. So originally, fishing ended up being a kind of a vital way that I, connected with nature from a very, very young age.
Yeah, and did you say in your book, correct me, it might have been a person that you were speaking to, but there was a story of, I think yourself would go down to this fishing hole, and then eventually a road was created nearby, and people ended up going down to this water, this fishing hole, and they overfished the area, and then you had to move on. Was that yourself that you're referring to, or was that someone else?
That was somebody else. That was a guy named Mike Dombeck, who's he's the former head of the U.S. Forest Service, which is this giant federal agency here that manages 93 million acres of land. So it was, Mike had that experience of exactly as you say. This place that he loved to fish growing up. Road shows up, and immediately his special spot is kind of overrun, and he ended up being this amazing champion of roadless areas, of protecting those places in America's national forest system that don't have roads in them, and he kind of traces his road antipathy back towards that childhood experience.
Wow, and makes sense. Now you mentioned Mike, I recall. Yes, for yourself, fishing. What did that mean for you when you got your fishing rod, your tackle, your bait, and you went out to go fishing? What was that like for you?
I think this is something that I'm trying to explore now in this fish book that I'm writing. Look, one of the things about fish, of course, I mean, fish are just unbelievably diverse, right? There are, many times more fish than there are birds or mammals or reptiles or amphibians. Just this, spectacularly diverse, beautiful group of animals that we don't generally see, right? They're all around us, and yet they're concealed from us by water, right? They're not like birds. They don't, visit the feeders in our backyards.
No,
I remember having this. Yeah. There's just so many like wonderful, incredible things. Like I was thinking about this recently. I had this great experience a few years ago where I grew up near the Hudson River. That's kind of the big river that flows through the state of New York and empties out into the ocean right at New York City.
Right.
And I had a chance to go out on this fish surveying boat with some scientists, and we were on the river, basically, within eyesight of the town that I'd grown up in, and they set these nets, and they caught this 8-foot long sturgeon, and sturgeon are just the most incredible animals, right? They're one of the oldest lineages of fish. They're these ancient, prehistoric, they predate the dinosaurs. They're just these giant, they're so bizarre looking and beautiful. They're covered in kind of bony plating, and they have almost these catfish-like whiskers that come down from their chins. Just an amazing animal, right? And I'd never seen one, and yet here they were, swimming by the place where I'd grown up, right? So that idea of there being this whole concealed aquatic world, I just found that to be incredibly interesting and powerful, and for me, fishing and eventually scuba diving was a way of accessing that unseen aquatic world.
Yeah, and that's a world that you're right is very hidden, and people don't see. Something that is being I also can see the fascination with. I've some of the videos I did on this channel before I moved it to where I was focusing just on the podcast. I wanted to find the places that were not seen because everyone does these videos of these locations and looks above the water.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get to those locations and look below the water as well. And there was this Mount Barney is a mountain probably 2 hours away from where I live, and you're at an elevation. I think it was 900 feet above sea level, something like that. It's fairly high, and there's this water hole that was so deep you could not see the bottom, and we're up this mountain, and this water hole is so deep, and I don't know what's at the bottom of it. I would need scuba gear to get to the bottom of this hole, and it's so secluded. But, and it's on this creek, this creek waterfall line that goes through. But yeah, the underwater world is pretty something. And so the fishing really spoke to you as a child, and that kind of helped form your passion for nature as well. Could you give us a couple steps moving up till now, and what it looked like to different jobs and experiences you've had to be able to now do what you do presently?
Yeah, let's see. So, after college, I had a few different kind of ecology tech type of jobs. I worked briefly for the National Park Service in Yellowstone National Park. That was fish work. That was basically killing. I don't want to be too euphemistic. Killing the invasive fish, the non-native ones that had been stocked years earlier and were causing all kinds of ecological problems, and then putting in the native trout, that had historically been in that area. So I did that. I worked, I had a position tagging sea turtles in North Carolina. That was really fun. Monitoring these turtles that were coming ashore to lay their eggs, and protecting the nests from predators, and helping to monitor that population. I did some urban forestry work in New York City, doing some research in forests and pretty urban parts of New York, in the Bronx. So I did all of these kind of field ecology things, but the whole time I was also writing. I was writing. I had various blogs, and I was, I started to do some freelance writing for various publications. Like kind of early 20s. Yep. And over time, the writing just became, the piece of that work that I enjoyed the most. That just became the kind of the full gig over time. So, starting in 2014 really is when I began working full time as a journalist, and that entails writing articles for different places. I write I'm doing a piece for National Geographic right now. The Atlantic, the New Yorker, all kinds of different spots. And like I said at the start of this conversation, it's a cool gig. I mean, I'm always really grateful to all of those scientists who kind of let me into their world, right? That was one of the really amazing experiences I had working on the road ecology book. I got to go to Brazil for a couple of weeks, to be part of this project that was studying the impacts of highways on giant anteaters, which is just such another amazing, bizarre alien animal that was just so much fun and thrilling to see in person.
Can I ask, Ben, how did you get into contact or have that how did you reach that group that was doing that study? Was there like a post on Facebook, author with the name of Ben looking for a gentleman of that name and of that skill to come to Brazil and look at anteaters? Obviously not, but how did you come across that opportunity?
Yeah, that was, I think, to my point, I'm just, really, really lucky that I kind of reach out cold to a lot of these projects and places, and say, hey, can I just come spend a week with you? And so many of them say yes. So in the case of that anteater project, I had, one of the kind of the prominent road ecologists who I had met and interviewed years earlier was this guy named Marcel Hauser, who's he's in Montana. He's a Dutch guy who lives in the U.S. now. And so when I was starting the book, I reached out to Marcel and said, hey, where are the interesting stories? Where should I go working on this road ecology book? And he had done a lot of work in Brazil, working with students down there and helping to consult on some wildlife crossing projects, I think. Right. And so he said, you should go to Brazil and you should talk to this student of mine who's done some work down there. So then I called his student and said, hey, who else in Brazil should I talk to? And she was like, well, there's this great project called Anteaters and Highways, and you should reach out to them. And so I emailed, I just sent a cold email to the guy who ran that project and said, hey, I'm writing this book. This looks really cool. Can I come down sometime? Amazingly, he said yes, and that's how so many of these stories happen, is they're sort of these tertiary connections through friends of friends. And again, I'm just really lucky that, at the number of people who are willing to let me into their world. And, over time, it's become a little bit easier. When I was just starting out, I didn't really have many articles to my name, right? I didn't have much publication track record that I could point to, right? And so, I think people were a little bit more skeptical. And now I can say, hey, I've written a couple of books and all of these articles, and people I think understand that I'm legitimate. Yeah, exactly. So that helps. That helps.
It would help having that extra those articles to back you up, and also all years of experience. I mean, why wouldn't you want to have someone with that experience, with your experience now, coming along on a journey and looking at anteaters? That's amazing. What would be one of the I guess funnel in a little bit, because you're like, that was about early 20s, early to mid 20s. You were doing you were a journalist, and then you started 2014 is about that time. And then you wrote your book in 2019 for beavers, and then 2023 you've written the book on road ecology. That's kind of a broad picture. If we could funnel it in, what has been a very pivotal point in your journey in this field of wildlife that you had maybe a decision to make, and the decision was maybe high tense, low tense, didn't even think about it maybe at the moment, but now looking back, you can see that was pretty pivotal. Does there anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, that's a nice question, Jaden. I mean, I think that for me, so writing the beaver book, I mean, that was an interesting. So the way that came about was it was all very serendipitous. I had. So I mentioned earlier that I'd gone to this beaver conference, right? This beaver workshop, and I met all of these beaver scientists there. But I didn't start working on the book right away. I wrote a few articles about beavers for a couple of different magazines. Okay. And then maybe a year or two later, I got an email out of the blue from a publishing company, and one of their editors had basically identified this growing national interest in beaver restoration, and had gone online looking for somebody who had written about beavers before who might be willing to write a book about that subject. And so this guy emailed me and wow. said, hey, I read your articles. I can see that you have a proud love of the beaver. That was the phrase that he used. Would you be interested in potentially taking those articles and expanding them into a book? That was something I had to think about a lot. Do I really want to spend, the next couple of years just writing about beavers? Is this, am I going to make enough money doing this to survive? That's a consideration, right? And so, I talked to, some older writer kind of mentors of mine, some of whom said, don't do it. Some of whom said, go for it. Okay. And so, that was, kind of this pivotal point in my life. And eventually I decided to say yes, and obviously wrote the book, and it ended up being this incredible experience. And I'm, here I am many years later, still writing and talking about beavers. I just can't escape them. Right. and the book was, was successful. I
Yes,
think.
obviously. Yeah.
And so, and so, yeah, so that, so when I think about, kind of my professional turning points, the two roads diverging in a wood and trying to decide which one to take, I think that taking the road to the beaver book helped, that knocked over a lot of dominoes in my life since then.
Yeah. And how did that feel when you received that email out of the blue? You're doing your day, this is late evening and the sun's gone down already, and you sit in front of your computer and you opened up this email. At that moment, seeing a random cold email, how did that feel?
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was mostly exciting. I think that, even though I did have to do a lot of thinking about it, I think on some level I probably knew that I was going to end up doing it because, I had, I had wanted to write a book. I mean, I think about, as a kid, I was a prolific reader of nature books myself, and I had always wanted to write a book about conservation and about wildlife. And here was this. I mean, at that point, I think I don't know, maybe I was like 28 or 29, and here was this, this opportunity to do that, kind of falling into my lap. And so, I think I was mostly really excited, and again, I think even though I spent a lot of time thinking about it after that, I think that in my gut, I probably knew I was going to do it from the moment that I opened that email.
Wow, that's pretty something, and that was that's a look. It's a good story. It's a good outcome to your story that it has been. You're now writing the third book. Is this something that also you were reached out to for this book, or is this something that you've initiated on your own terms?
Yeah, the last two were both ideas that I proposed basically. And for me, I mean, a book about fish is, as I mentioned earlier, fish are so kind of integral to my own, my own passion for nature and wildlife. And so, I think on some level, I also knew that I was eventually going to write a book about fish. But I mean, for me, the part that's really rewarding is just, knowing that these, the work is helpful in some way, right? I mean, I so many, the beaver book, especially just because it's been out for a little while now. So it's had more opportunity to kind of trickle through the conservation community and find people. And there are just so many good outcomes there, cattle ranchers who, stopped killing the beavers on their ranch because they read the book, or, state fish and wildlife agencies that, changed their policies around trapping to protect more beavers, or, people who devoted their life savings to, beaver conservation groups, because they read the book and were inspired. So that, that feels really good to know that, that there are more wild animals out there today, and there are more acres of wetland habitat that beavers have created because of, some words you put on paper. That's a kind of a really fortunate, magical feeling.
Wow, and I makes sense. Makes sense. Before, Ben, we kind of dam this conversation up for the time being, and I want to get to the overrated, underrated questions with yourself. Could you give just a very quick overview of what it might look like for both someone different? You can separate it if it's different, but if it's the same, add it all in. Someone reaching out to you and asking you to write a book, you writing a book by yourself, what does that look like? Could you give a quick overview of the processes that you've that you went through and had to go through to be able to have a book, and not just a book, but a successful book?
Yeah, I mean, the processes have all been pretty similar. I mean, for the beaver book, it was funny. I mean, that, instruction or direction, they just said, write a book about beavers in a couple of years. There was no, they weren't prescriptive in any way. So, for me, I mean, it always starts with finding sources and stories, right? People and places to write about. And, those come from a couple different places. I mean, obviously, the peer-reviewed literature, right? Google Scholar, that helps a lot. I mean, that's right now I'm writing about, salmon, let's say. And so I'll go into Google Scholar, and I'll type in, Pacific salmon management, or Castor canadensis, which is the Latin name for beavers, and just, see what comes up, right? And contact a lot of the authors who have written a lot of scientific papers about this stuff. So that peer-reviewed literature is a good way to find interesting sources and stories. But social media has been hugely helpful for me as well. Back in the days when Twitter was, still really active and viable, before Elon took it over. There's the road ecology hashtag was really popular. So I would just search the road ecology hashtag, and there are all kinds of great road ecologists who were tweeting actively, and I contacted a lot of them and said, hey, I'd love to talk to you. Those two pots of sources,
metaphorical
peer-reviewed
gold,
literature and social media, right? Exactly, metaphorical gold for sure. And then it's just a matter of talking to as many people as you can, and figuring out first, who's got a cool story to tell, and second, who will allow you into their world, who will let you come to Brazil to put satellite collars on giant anteaters.
Yeah, and then with the publication groups, what's that process look like? So you've got the research portion of that. What about the publication rights, monetary flow afterwards, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so you've got a publisher, right, and a company who publishes the books, and basically the way that works is, they give you a certain amount of money up front, that's called the advance, and then the book comes out, and ideally it does well, and so then you over time, as you sell more copies, ideally you also get royalties, a little percentage of every book that you sell, and so that's how it works. And the publisher, a lot of, like, I do a lot of radio interviews and podcasts, and public speaking for various conservation organizations, and some of that stuff is stuff that the publisher will set up, but most of it is stuff that either I find, or stuff that just comes to me. So it's success, and certainly a bigger part of my life than I thought it was going to be. I think that people, like, there's this sort of this conception of the writer as being this kind of hermit, who goes into sort of a shack in the woods somewhere and never talks to anybody, and lives in total isolation. Exactly. Yeah, totally secluded from the world, right? But actually so much of my life now is public speaking. Traveling around giving talks to different audiences, or over webinars over Zoom these days. I've come to really enjoy that stuff. I mean, it's because look, ultimately, I write about the topics that I care about, and if I want other people to care about them, I have to get the message in front of the right folks. And the book is part of that. But if I can give public talks that also convince other people to care about beavers and wildlife crossings, I view that as a critical part of the mission as well.
Yeah, that's a good perspective to have, and I would say, question: have you always been a great public speaker, or has this been something you've grown along in the journey as well?
I've definitely gotten better over time. At the outset, it was challenge. I mean, I think the biggest challenge doing the speaking. I mean, it's the same as the challenge of writing, right? It's just honing the message, and making it as concise and persuasive as possible. So I get up and I give a 45-minute public presentation with slides. Well, how do you make that 45 minutes an interesting narrative? How do you get the themes of the talk to flow together? What is the logical structure of the talk? I go back and I think about a lot of the early talks that I gave, and it was sort of like just dumps of random information. And now I think I've gotten a lot better at stitching stories together in the context of a public presentation, which is the same challenge as writing, of course.
as well. Okay, and that makes sense. Now, Ben, I understand getting close to the end of the time that you're available for. So just say thank you for talking with me thus far. Do you have time to run through this quick game of overrated, underrated?
Hit me, dude. I'm ready.
Okay. Reflective roadside markers to deter deer and other mammalian species.
Overrated.
Overrated. Okay.
Overrated.
For what? Why is it so overrated? You felt very confident there.
Oh, there's not a lot of research that suggests that stuff works, and there's more research showing it doesn't work. I would say, or at least that it doesn't work as well as we might hope it does.
That makes sense. You're staying true to what you said in your book. Awesome.
Right.
Number 2, public awareness campaigns about wildlife on roads.
Yeah, I would say underrated. We need a lot more awareness. At the same time, I don't think that awareness campaigns can replace those wildlife crossings, right? Because you can never get everybody to drive slower and more cautiously. The best thing we can do is to build those passages. So I'm all for making people care more about this issue, obviously. But I also don't think that increased awareness is going to totally solve the problem.
Awesome. Number 3, the role of scavengers in road ecology.
Underrated. Yeah, I like that one. I find that to be so interesting. The idea that roads are kind of this ecosystem in a sense, and those scavengers are a big beneficiary of the ecosystem, and in the book I write about some pretty interesting research here in the American West, basically showing that golden eagles end up eating a lot of carcasses, and if you actually just drag those carcasses away from the roads, those eagles can basically eat in peace without running the risk of being hit by a car themselves. You actually use it. Right. So you could take that, that unfortunate tragedy of the roadkill and actually make it a pretty big benefit from eagles. So I like the idea of thinking more about scavengers and how we can make the world better and safer for them too.
Got a brilliant idea for a device. I'm thinking, at least say with Ipswich, the Ipswich City Council, they have city council trucks that drive around. I'm thinking in America, there's snow and you got snow plow. So you got to customize a snow plow front that goes on the side of a city council work truck, and you just kind of scoops the wildlife off the road as you drive past. So you're not even losing time. It just kind of folds out and then scoops the wildlife off the road.
You should patent that invention. Yeah, that's a moneymaker for sure.
That's going to work out, I know. Number 4, AI-powered roadkill detection systems.
That's a good question. Let's see. I mean, that's I think that might both be underrated. Depending on how you think about it. I mean, it's it's underrated in a sense that I think that self-driving cars in general are a good opportunity to prevent roadkill to some extent, right? I mean, we know that eventually, or we don't know this, but I feel confident saying that eventually autonomous vehicles are going to be a lot better at avoiding big animals than human drivers are, right? Because they're especially at night, their radar and lidar and infrared cameras are going to spot animals better than we do and avoid them. But so in that sense, I feel good about the future, the long-term future of large animal avoidance. But it's not going to be at all helpful for those snakes or turtles or lizards or rodents, those smaller animals that the AI and those sensors don't detect, right? So I think the self-driving future, it'll be a better time to be a deer and maybe even a worse time to be a snake.
That's a good perspective. That makes sense. Well thought. Number 5, final one, the idea of depaving roads for conservation. So you spoke a little bit of this in the book.
Oh man, so underrated. Yeah, I mean, I'm all about road obliteration and decommissioning. Especially up in those national forests that we have out in the wilderness. We've got tens of thousands of miles of, old logging roads that we don't need and are still causing big environmental problems. So let's rip those roads up and let nature reclaim those habitats for sure.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions for the overrated, underrated segment. Thank you, Ben. I just want to say as well, your books just confirming is Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. That was back in 2019. And then the new book, Crossing, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. And then maybe in the next year or two, this new book shall be coming out. Do you have a release date on that yet?
We don't, yeah. Year or two sounds optimistic, but I'm shooting for sometime in 2027.
Okay, 2027. Keep your eyes out, listeners. Keep your eyes out for the book in 2027 if you want to learn more about ecology of fish, particular of all things aquatic.
Fish. We're keeping. We got to draw the line somewhere. So no, I don't want to see any cephalopods or crustaceans in there. We're just sticking to
solid
the fishes,
hard
man.
fish. Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks, Ben, for coming on. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you for watching or listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to find more information on today's guest or more information on the podcast, you can find those details in the description below. Otherwise, I hope and look forward to seeing you in the next one.